The Vietnam War started as a result of the U.S. strategy of containment during the Cold War, which aimed to prevent the spread of communism throughout the world. After the Second War, the Soviet Union, with its major role in the war, emerged as a superpower with strong influence over Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria and East Germany, and parts of Asia, including China and Korea. The US and its Western allies considered communism in the form of USSR as the greatest rival and post-war threat to their democracy and capitalism. The turning point in Asia came in 1949 when China became a communist country after Chinese communist rebels led by Mao Zedong won the Civil War and took control over mainland China. From 1950, and the U.S. started to support South Korea in the war against communism, North backed by China and the USSR. Meanwhile, the U.S. also sent the Military Assistant Advisory Group to assist the French in the First Indochina War with the goal of containing the spread of communism. Vietnam was a French colony from the mid-19th century until 1954, when they signed a treaty in Geneva Conference which temporarily separated the North Communist from the South Anti-Communist at the 17th parallel after the French defeat in Dien Bien Phu. The French lost control of Vietnam approximately when the Korean War ended, which had left the country partitioned into North and South Korea, with China and the USSR actively supporting the North Communist government. Then, U.S. President Eisenhower regarded Vietnam as Korea all over again and feared the whole Southeast Asia, including Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, would fall into communism in domino effect similar to what happened in Eastern Europe. The loss of that essential regional trading area would encourage Taiwan, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand to compromise politically with communism. Therefore, the U.S. intervened in Vietnam, trying to keep the South Vietnamese domino from falling.
U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia began as early as 1950, when the U.S. was lending aid to their French allies and maintaining control of what was at the time French Indochina. The North Vietnamese forces eventually defeated the French, and the First Indochina War was ended in 1954. In 1954, the French abandoned their hold on Southeast Asia, and so French Indochina became several independent states: Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The U.S. maintained military aid to the Republic of Vietnam in an advisory level. In the early 1960s, U.S. troop levels tripled once in 1961 and again in 1962. By 1963, the first combat troops were deployed. 3,500 Marines were deployed in a defensive role only. By November 1963, Kennedy had deployed 16,000 military personnel, a massive increase from Eisenhower's 900 advisors. By 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the passing of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by the U.S. further escalated its involvement in Vietnam. The U.S. was reluctant to intervene militarily because it believed that the South Vietnamese government should defeat its foes on its own strength without relying on U.S. military. In 1965, the first major engagement between U.S. servicemen and the North Vietnamese Army took place in the Nha Trang River Valley. The battle in the Nha Trang River Valley became a momentous victory for the U.S. With a lopsided 12-to-1 kill ratio, U.S. command decided that a war of attrition would be the best course of action. By December 1965, there were 200,000 ground forces deployed in South Vietnam. U.S. involvement was fueled by the ongoing Cold War against Communist Russia. The conflict in Vietnam became a proxy war between the Communist-backed North Vietnamese and the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese. Through the containment strategy, the U.S. hoped to stop the spread of communism and maintain its allies in Asia.
With the ever-increasing need for fresh combat troops, the United States government, once again, like in previous wars, reinstituted the draft. The sons of all types of families were called upon once again to fight a war in a far-off country. As the violence escalated into the late 60s, so did the casualties on both sides. For the first time in our history as a nation, the war was broadcasted in brutal detail on the nightly news. Through these images, the American public began to find itself questioning, was the cause worth its price in blood to continue this war in Vietnam? In 1967, people from every walk of life became extremely sick of the war and began to protest on a massive scale. Some 30,000 protesters rallied at the Pentagon protesting for peace. It was not uncommon to hear protesters screaming, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" inside of the halls of the White House. Even people who supported the war at the onset found themselves questioning if the war was worth it due to the very little evidence that the U.S. was winning the war. Things came to a head in 1970 when 4 protesters were shot and killed by National Guard soldiers on the Kent State University campus during a peace protest. From these killings sprung thousands of nationwide protests on many college campuses.
Nothing good came out of the Vietnam War. The only things that we got were $134 billion worth of war debt and battered spirits of battered veterans. One reason why this is that when the veterans returned home, they weren't met with loving arms or loving hearts. They were met with shame and disgust from their peers. Many of them spat upon the veterans and even called them baby killers. This could have been very well because of the fact that many of the citizens had no idea what these veterans had been through, as well as them just wanting to forget the war. Another thing is that many of these veterans developed what is known as PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes from experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. Knowing that they were in the war for such a long time, there was no doubt where this came from. And overall, the veterans who returned were just forgotten, and it's truly a sad part of history. Although today many of these are slept upon, there are many lessons to come out of the Vietnam War. One lesson was to not misinterpret the enemy nor their ideals. What this led to was a misunderstanding of the enemy, which in this case is Vietnam, and ultimately led to poor planning and just suffering among the soldiers. Another lesson was to unify both the government and the citizens. And to elaborate what I mean by that is that both the citizens and the government of a country should come to consensus or come to an agreement on whether or not to enter any sort of foreign conflict. One other lesson was no international conflict has an immediate solution. And by this, we must learn that no matter what, we cannot live in a peaceful world. There will always be conflict, and that is just something we must learn and go forward with.